Okay, we are at Masechet Eruvin. We're gonna study Daf Nun Tet, which is two main topics. First, using an expert surveyor, and some of the laws are regarding that when there are discrepancies between the measurements of different surveyors. And the next Mishnah is going to be about a private and public city. In other words, a city owned by one person that may become public, or the other way around, and making an eruv around that city. Okay, so we start with our Mishnah. En modedin ela min ha mumche. You have to use an expert surveyor. As we saw last time, there are a lot of complications, valleys and mountains and walls, and how exactly to measure. So therefore, don't just get anyone to measure, but someone who is trained. Okay, good. But even trained surveyors may have differences. If you find that the place where the surveyor measured is in one spot, it's farther out, and then down a little bit further down, it's closer in. In other words, the surveyor's own markings don't line up, and so there's a discrepancy. Then what do? Answer is Sham'in l'makom sheriba. Then you can be lenient, and the outermost one, that's the one you can use, and you make a straight line and assume that that is the correct one, because we're lenient regarding techumin. Riba le'achad u'met le'achad sham'in lamerubeh. This seems to be redundant. If one is greater and one is less, you follow the greater. The Talmud will ask why about this redundancy. And even a slave or a maidservant, usually they are not qualified to be witnesses to testify. But regarding this matter, if they come and say, "Oh yes, I remember the boundary is up till here. That's where we always used to walk, even if the boundary marker went missing or something," they are believed, and you don't have to go and do a whole survey again. We can trust them. Again, because it's Rabbanan, and so we're more lenient. Because after all, since this whole thing is the Rabbanan, that means technically, according to the Torah, you can walk more than 2,000 amot. There may be a Deoraita limit, but it'd be much farther than that. And so therefore, since the whole law, the whole prohibition is midrabanan, therefore the rabbis, when they made all these laws about how you calculate and all that, they want to be lenient, as lenient as possible. And that's why we permit going to the farthest marker, and we permit people that are generally not witnesses to be good witnesses. All right, that is the Mishnah. Okay, Gemara is really just making a few clarifications on this. The language in the first part is a little bit confusing. That says you follow the one that's further out. What? So you follow the one that's further out, but not the one that's further in? So obviously that's not what it means. Emma af l'makom sheriba. You can even go to the further out one. Obviously you can go to the one that's closer in if there's a discrepancy. Okay, now about that redundancy. We just said that you follow the greater one. It's the same thing. The second clause in the Mishnah is talking about when there are two different surveyors. Maybe they're working at the same time or one after the other, and they come up with different calculations. So we can follow the one that gives more space. And so we follow the lenient opinion. So the first case is where we see two markers, and the second one, maybe the same surveyor in two spots somehow got a discrepancy. In the second case, is talking about two different surveyors. So either way, we follow the lenient opinion. He says, so Abayas comes and gives a limitation on quite how far the discrepancy can be, and we will still follow the lenient opinion. And the measurement is as follows. Let me explain. His point is that it has to be a discrepancy that is somehow explainable. So up to 585 is permitted, not more than that. How to get that number? As follows: when you're making eruv, when you're measuring eruv techumin, you're supposed to go 2,000 amot horizontal and vertical. And from that corner, you calculate the diagonal, which is going to be 2,800 amot long, right? That's the hypotenuse. That's the correct way to do it, and you get longer. The hypotenuse is going to be longer than just the 2,000. However, if the person makes a mistake and does 2,000 for the total hypotenuse, well, then the sides will end up being 1,400 and 14 something and change, for 14, 15 and change, right? Something like that. And therefore the discrepancy between the 2,000, what should be 2,000 here, right? This whole side should be 2,000. And what it ends up being when you calculate this way is 585. This is a mistake, 572. Okay, so his point is as follows. If the one that's farther out is 585 or less than the one that's further in, then you say, you know what, the one that's further in just made that calculation mistake and, you know, made the diagonal wrong. So we can explain what mistake they made, and therefore we can assume it's wrong. But if it's greater than that, let's say it's 600, 700, 800 amot discrepancy between the marker that's closer and the marker that's farther, then there's something wrong here. Someone made, you know, and it's too confusing, and therefore you have to go and do the survey again, and you can't just assume that the farther one is correct. Okay, good. That's a good, you know, principle in general. Like whenever, if we see a manuscript or anything that looks like it's a mistake, you always want to find some explanation of how that mistake might have crept in, and that gives more support to a possibility it's a mistake. If you can't explain how it might have been gotten there, then you might have to work harder to figure out what it means. Okay, and the last part of the Mishnah, Shelo amru chachamim et hadavar lachmir ela lehakel, because all these laws are only to be lenient, they're drabanan. Now that's what the Mishnah said, but we have a Braita, this is the opposite. Vatanya, lo amru chachamim et hadavar lehakel ela lachmir, that regarding all these laws of Tichum Shabbat, the rabbis were not lenient, but rather were stringent. That's the opposite of what Mishnah said. So let's try to reconcile them. So actually, both of these statements are true. As follows: what the Torah said is that Torah says you can walk even more than 2,000 amot. So the rabbis came and were machmir to say no, only 2,000 amot. That's what the Braita says, to be machmir on the words of the Torah. They're giving a offense. But once you have that law, then the rest of the details about how you measure and how you calculate and who you trust and all that, that is lenient. So the rabbis gave all those rules in a lenient manner. Okay, so and that way both of the statements are reconciled. Okay, now the next Mishnah. Now we're moving away from Eruv Techumin and back to Eruv Chatzerot, joining courtyards together, joining backyards together, and joining courtyards together with shituf mevaot, when you have a lot of different courtyards that open up to one alleyway, an alleyway to one thoroughfare. So then you can join together a whole city through this eruvin. Okay. All right. So as follows: Ir shel yachid v'naaset shel rabim me'arvin et kula. Let's say you have a private city. In other words, a city owned by one person. Sometimes if someone owns an island or whatever, they might own a city. And then they rent out houses in it, but they own the whole thing. That person can make an eruv around the entire city, right? No problem. And then everybody can walk in the entire city. And now here's what the Mishnah doesn't tell you, is that if you have a city that belongs to the public, right? Public city, that's public from the beginning, you have to leave a piece out. One section has to be left out. The reason is because if you enclose every part of the city, every home in the city, the kids that grow up there will not know that there's a law at all that you're not allowed to carry. And then they're going to go to some other city one day, and they're not going to even know that carrying is prohibited on Shabbat. I had this experience myself because we have an eruv everywhere we live, and this summer my home was was outside the eruv, and I had to teach my kids that you're not allowed to carry, and they never heard of this before, and it took a lot of getting used to. What does that mean, that you're not allowed to carry? Can I wear my hat? Can I wear my tie? Can I bring a handkerchief? Okay, so this actually makes a lot of sense. Now, so a private city, you can do the whole thing. A public city, you have to leave one section out so everybody knows. Oh, you can't carry there. Why not? Oh, because you can't carry. But what if it transitions? So if it was a private city, and eventually a lot of people moved in there, and it became a public city, when it went public, an IPO, then still ma'arvin kula, the original law gets grandfathered in, and you can make an eruv around the whole city, right? You don't have to stop it. How about the opposite? If it belonged to the public and therefore you had to leave a piece out, and then someone buys the whole city, then you still cannot make an eruv around the whole thing. The stringency also gets grandfathered in. Who knows? Maybe it'll become public again. So we're not going to change the status. The only way to make the whole city an eruv is if there is one section outside that is similar to Ir Hadasha. Hadasha turns out to be actually the name of a city in Judea. It's a small one that has 50 diurin, right? Just 50 residents. Even if it's a small section, then that the rest of it is permitted. Bishimon is even more lenient and says the section that's excluded just has to be 6 houses, 2 houses each in 3 courtyards. That's it. That's already a section of the city. If that's out, then everybody will know, oh, carrying is not permitted. Okay, I feel bad for those 6 families that they can't carry, but maybe they'll get a good deal on their homes for their inconvenience. All right, so that is the Mishnah. And now the Gemara is going to go through many different permutations. First, let's see an example. Where is a case where we see that there was a city that belonged to a single person and then it became public? Iskarta is a Persian word meaning a plot of land that belonged to the exilarch. Now that's the Jewish person who was the head of the community in Persia. This very important, rich, powerful man. So his family owned a whole city. It was like the capital, Jewish capital in Persia. So that eventually became public as many people were going in and out and lived there. And so that's an example. Okay. Amar le Rav Nachman, my ta'ama. Now we're going to analyze. That ends up not being such a great example because it's not typical. So he's asking, why? How come in that city they could make an eruv around the whole thing? If it's because there are many people that are going to the harmana, that's another Greek word that means the ruler. There are many people that are going to the eshkaluta. They have to ask him questions. They have to get permission. They have to ask him to appoint the judge in a certain place. And so since there are many people going there, they'll all remind each other, this is, oh, you know about the law of carrying? Yes, okay, right? And so is that why you can carry throughout the whole city? Well, then that logic would apply actually to any city that has a Jewish community. Every Shabbat morning, everybody comes to gather together in Bet Knesset, and so they'll all study together, they'll learn the laws together. So therefore, just having a lot of people there is not a good enough reason, because that would apply in all cities. All cities have some Jewish community. It's interesting that they mentioned Shabbat morning specifically. It sounds like even back then, weekday minyan was less than Shabbat morning and even Friday night. Okay. Rather, let's pick a better example, which is this guy, Natezui, had once owned a city himself and eventually became a public city. And so that is a good example where when it was a private city, you were allowed to make an eruv throughout the whole thing. And so when it became public also, that permission is grandfathered in. All right, now we have a baraita, and this is a long baraita, and then we're going to analyze each section, and that's going to take us right to the end of the daf. Tanur Banan, it's an expansion of the Mishnah. Ayir shel yachid v'nasit shel rabim. Urshut harabim obedet betocha kesad me'arvin ota. what if it's a little bit more complicated case? You have a city that was once private, a private city, so it has just small streets, there's not so many people, you don't have to worry. Now it became a public city, and we just said in the Mishnah that you're allowed to make an eruv in the whole thing. But once it becomes a public city, now it has a main street, all right, a thoroughfare, that's a Reshut Harabim. So how can you possibly make an eruv when you have a main street going through it? All right, kind of like this picture. So answer is oseh lechi mikan velechi mikan, or kora mikan vekora mikan, venoseh venoten ba'emsa. Let's see a picture. So what you do is you put a beam here, and another beam all the way at the other end, or a cross beam here and a cross beam there, and that way that is kind of a reminder, a symbolic wall or enclosure, and that way that Reshut Harabim will become permitted to be included within the Eruv. All right, that's what the Braita says. You have to make sure not that you can't make two Eruvs, like one on this side and one on the other side of the city, because that's no good, because since they share a main street, so everybody's gonna be walking in and out of both halves. So you can do the whole thing, but you can't do halves. Ella o kula o mavoy b'mifnei asma. You can either make a eruv in the whole thing, or you can do each subsection, like in this picture, right? So there's each mavoy. You can make each mavoy can make their own eruv, and separately. That's okay. Or you could do the whole city as one. That's also okay. But you can't do half. Okay. Well, the Gemara will discuss more about half which way. The Baraita continues, Hayta shel rabim v'hareh hi shel rabim. If a city was always a public city and remains a public city, then generally you can't make an eruv around the whole thing, right? That's more problematic. However, even there, in that case, there is a way. If it has just one entrance, then you can make an eruv around the whole thing, because that thoroughfare doesn't go from end to end. So since you can't go through, has a wall on one end, so it's not considered such a public thoroughfare, and so you could make an eruv around the whole thing. Okay, this is useful for something like Ocean Parkway, which ends, right? It ends at the ocean, so it doesn't really go through the entire city and open on the other side. All right, that's the end of the Braita, and now we'll analyze each piece. Man Tana de mi'arba Reshut Harabim. Who is the Tana that says this law here that you can put a lechi on each side of Reshut Harabim and then be able to make an eruv that includes that main thoroughfare? Whose opinion is that? Amar Rabbi Huna b'nei Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Yehuda he Tanya yated al ken Amar Rabbi Yehuda mi sheyesh lo shene batim b'shnei shidei Reshut Harabim oseh lechi mikan velechi mikan o kora mikan vekora mikan venoseh venoten ba'emsa. Amru lo en me'avin Reshut Harabim bechach. This is a braita we saw several times before, and he says, well, he's just talking about a smaller case. Let's say this guy owns this house, and he also owns this house on the other side of Reshut Harabim. And he wants to be able to walk, to carry from his houses on each side of the street. So he can put a lechi on this side and a lechi on the other side of the house, and that makes a symbolic enclosure between his two houses, and then he can carry in between. So you see that's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, and so Rabbi Yehuda thinks that with two lechis you can enclose a Reshut Harabim, and so too this is the same thing, just on a bigger scale of doing it with the entire street all the way from beginning to end. But in that baraita, the rabbis say to him, no, you can't enclose, you can't make an eruv around the Reshut Harabim with two lechis. So therefore, this braita that we're analyzing here must agree with this braita, and therefore is only the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. All right. Usually we try to find some way to make it everybody's opinion, but not here. That's it. This is only Rabbi Yehuda's opinion that has a special leniency. All right. Now, Amar Mod is a key word, quoting that piece, next piece of the braita. We said you can't make two eruvs in each half, one half and one half. So which way? Amar Rav Papa sounds like maybe either way, but Rav Papa clarifies. Amar Rav Papa lo amru ela leorka aval lerochba me'arbin. What it means is as follows. What you're not allowed to do is this way. You can't make two halves that goes right through the street, right down the double yellow line in the middle of the street. The reason is because these people have access to the main thoroughfare, and these people also have main access to the thoroughfare. So they're really mixed. You can't separate two halves of a city if they're both using the main thoroughfare, because that's joining them together, and they're all mixing there. So that's not okay. But what you can do is split it this way down the middle, and that way these people all have access to one side of the street, and they can go in and out from this entrance. And the people on this side, on the south, can go in with this entrance, and they can use the entirety. That way, it's better because they're not mixing, they're not sharing one thoroughfare. It almost becomes like two separate cities. That's Rav Papa's point. So he has a leniency. He's limiting the Baraita only to one case. All right, Keman. Now, this is what Rav Papa said. Whose opinion is it regarding now another Baraita that we're about to quote? The lo kerebi Akiva, the kerebi Akiva ha'amar regel hamoteret bimkoma oseret afilu shelo bimkoma. So we're going to compare that case of a thoroughfare to this case here, where you have an inner courtyard and an outer courtyard. And the law here is that if the people in the inner courtyard make an eruv, and the ones in the outer courtyard make their own eruv, so then they can each carry within their own courtyard. The problem is here that since the people in the inner courtyard, their only access to the public domain, to the Shut Rabim, is through the outer courtyard. Well, then that ruins the outer courtyard eruv. Right, because you have, they can their eruv is not really enclosed because these people are using it as a thoroughfare, and so therefore the inner courtyard is allowed to carry in theirs, and that's what he means here. Haregel hamuteret bimkoma. So regel meaning walking or carrying that is permitted in its own place, or seret causes a prohibition even in a section that's not its own place, right? They can, at a distance, they can make this one prohibited. That is Rabbi Akiva's opinion. Hachamim say it's okay. So we're comparing now the two cases because in this case also, what you have here is a courtyard. And you can imagine this kind of like an inner courtyard and an outer courtyard. So these are people that are in the inner courtyard, and they can go. There's still an opening here. Maybe there's some kind of doorway, and so they can go through here, and thereby you would say these people can carry, but they're going through here, and that would cause these people not to be able to carry. And then vice versa, these people will go through here, and then no one can carry. So the point is that this cannot follow the opinion of Rabbi Akiva because then it's too similar to this case. But since Chachamim permit in this case, then Rav Papa can agree in such a case with the Chachamim. All right, the answer is somewhat obvious. Afilu tema Rabbi Akiva. The truth is that Rav Papa can follow both opinions, both the rabbis who permit this case, and they can even follow Rabbi Akiva that prohibits in this case. The only reason he prohibited this case is because there's one courtyard into the other. The inner one has no other alternative. There's no other way to get out. So they have to go through here. That's what makes this outer courtyard no good, because it has a thoroughfare going through it. But in our case of the city cut in half, they each have their own entrance and exit. So these people will use this one, and these people use that one. And so, we don't, even if, a rare person can, I guess, go through the other one, but they don't have to. So therefore, since most of them are going to be using their own opening, it does not nullify the enclosure of the other side. And so therefore, the papa can be according to everyone. All right, good. We saw.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
Wouldn't this just be comparable to that case that we talked about, the centipede navoy that has the legs branching out?
Yes, where you have to close off each one. Generally, when you have a thoroughfare going all the way through, you have to make a wall on one side, right, or close off each of these. We're going to see that in a second. Actually, this is coming up in the next part, next section of the daf. Yeah. So yeah, hold that thought.
Also, different thing. Why, in the case that you're cutting it in half the long way, why would we ever assume that that would be okay? We don't have anything analogous to that.
This one is not okay.
I'm saying, but why would we even assume that it would be okay?
Because we said that you're allowed to make an eruv around the entire thing. So you might say, kal vachomer, if I can make eruv around the entire thing, then making a half is even better. So this is teaching you that you can't cut in half when you're sharing a thoroughfare. All right, that's an important principle. Okay, but don't lose your train of thought, because we just said Rav Papa. Now we have another version of Rav Papa. In this one, he says one case is allowed, the other case is not allowed. But there's another version of Rav Papa that's Ika de Amre, that prohibits altogether. Amar Papa, don't say that in one direction you can't, but the other direction you can. Even cutting it in half, including cutting the picture on the left here, even this is also not allowed. That's his clarification of the Baraita, to make sure you know that neither case is allowed. Okay, well, if that's what Papa says, then now instead of Rabbi Akiba being a question about him, is actually a support. Right? Kiman, ke Rabbi Akiba. He actually must follow Rabbi Akiba, because Rabbi Akiba is the one that said, in this case also, right, the one in the inner courtyard, because they're going out this way, they nullify this enclosure. So too, in this case, yes, these people will nullify because they are going out this way, and these people nullify going out that way. So you know what? That makes more sense according to Rabbi Akiva. But what about according to the Rabbanan that say this is permitted? If this case is permitted, then shouldn't this case also be permitted? And so maybe he's only following Rabbi Akiva. So I'm sorry. Okay. So afilu tema, right? Kiman. Let me just get back. Oh, I'm on the wrong page. Okay. Kiman ke Rabbi Akiva. He seems to be following Rabbi Akiva. So we say no. Afilu tema rabbanan. You can even reconcile this prohibition regarding the city cut in halves. Can even be reconciled with the opinion of Rabbanan, who permit regarding the inner or outer courtyard case. How so? Ad kan la kam Rabbanan hatam ela b'shtei chaserot zo lifnim mizo depinimit achada ledasha umishtamesha aval hacha mimasu mesaleki reshut rabim mehacha. So Rabbanan can say they permit in this case because this can be closed off. In other words, the people in the outer courtyard can tell these guys, listen, we're not letting you through, because if you come through, then we can't carry anymore. And remember, that's like Midat Sedom. You know, you're doing something, and you're giving us a problem. You stay in your courtyard, we'll stay in our courtyard. And so since this is a private domain, they can close it off. And that's why, well, even if they don't close it off and one or two people come out, whatever. So that's why this case is permitted. However, in this case, we're talking about a public street, a highway. Nobody can close off a highway. If these people want to go in here, they usually go out this open one. But if they feel like going this way, it's shorter for them, then nobody can stop them. It's a public street. And since nobody can stop them, therefore they nullify this enclosure, and these people nullify the other enclosure. So even the Rabbanan, who permit in the case of the inner outer courtyard, could prohibit in all cases, this case and that case. All right, good. So now we have those two versions of Rav Papa, and we reconcile both versions according to both opinions. Okay, good. Amar Mor. Now the next section of the Baraita. O kula, o mavoy bifnei asmo. The last part said, right, you can either make an eruv around the entire city or each section, but not half. So each section. Wait a second, does this make sense? What's the reason you said you can't do half-half? Well, it's because each half nullifies the other one, right? Let's assume the last statement of the papa, that you can't do it either way. So mavoy mavoy nami asradade. The same. You have the same problem if you have many different courtyards. That everyone in this courtyard, these courtyards going to use it, and this courtyard is going to use it, and they're all sharing the same reshut harabim, so they'll all nullify each other, right? Wouldn't you have the same problem? Oh, it must be that it's talking about a case where you make a daka. Daka means a partition with a small opening. Maybe you have to duck under it to get through. So yeah, you can get through, but when you close off every mavoy in this way, the people in the mavoy are showing that they want to be their own space, and they are relinquishing their right to the public thoroughfare. And so since they're doing that and closing themselves off, therefore they do not nullify the other people that are using that have openings to a public thoroughfare. So only in that case. In other words, really you're right. If they were all open, they would all nullify each other. But if they're all closed off, then it's okay. And we have a precedent for this. If one person in a mavoy, one of the courtyards, makes a daka, makes this partition, then he doesn't have to join the eruv, and everybody else can make an eruv without him, and that's okay. So this would be the same case. All right, good. And last part of the baraita, hayta shel rabim, if it was public and it remains public, then the only way to make an eruv around the whole thing is if it has one opening, one entrance to the city, then you can still make an eruv. Now we have a story. One time Rabbi Zera came and he made an eruv in the city of Rabbi Chia. And obviously this was a public city, and yet he made an eruv around the whole thing. He didn't leave one section, one neighborhood out, right, in order to be a reminder for future generations about the laws of carrying. And this seems to be a problem because you in general, a public city, you cannot do the whole thing. So Abaye says, why did you do that? How come you didn't leave a neighborhood out as you're supposed to? He says, because there were some elders here, and they told me that Rabbi Chia, he used to, from a previous generation, when he was here, he made an eruv around the entire city. So I concluded, if he made an eruv around the whole city, and even back then it was a public city, it was always a public city, it must be he did it because before that, it wasn't always a public city. Before that, it was once a private city, and then it became a public city. And so, therefore, since Rabbi Chia did it in his time, at that time it was a private city, he made the whole thing, and now it became a public city, I'm still allowed to do the whole thing. That's why, because I have the testimony of the elders that it was once entirely enclosed in eruv. So that's why I did it. Abaye said, okay, so Abaye says, I have a longer report from these same elders, and there's a specific reason why they were, in that case, in those days, in the previous generation, allowed to encompass the whole city. It's not because it used to be private, but rather, says, this is actually what happened. It used to be that there was a garbage pile on one side of the city, right? And that's in the days of Rabbi Chia, there was a big garbage pile, and that was basically the same as a wall. And so that was a public city that had only one opening, which the Braita said, you're allowed to make an eruv around the whole thing. However, since that time, that garbage pile has been removed, and now it's a city with two openings. And so therefore, you're not allowed to make an eruv around the whole city. And so you see that these elders didn't give, originally did not give the Rabbi Zera the full story, and he mistakenly assumed that it used to be a private city and therefore could be grandfathered in. But in fact, now with this new information, he says, "Oh, I didn't know that." And so now with the new information, he changed his mind, and he realized that it was always a public city and it no longer has only one opening. So what do you have to do? He would have to either close an opening or leave one neighborhood out. Okay, and now we have a question about another case. Rav Ameh bar Ada harpana'a meraba. Sulam mikan ufetach mikan mahu. Oh, what if you have a case like this? You have a city it's a public city with one opening. What so it should be good. I can make an eruv around the whole thing. The problem is on the other side, there's a ladder's going up and ladders going down. So there is a wall, but you can get out by going up and down the ladder. Is that considered an enclosure, an enclosed city? That's only one, and you can make an eruv? Or since there's ladders here, is that considered an opening? And therefore it has two openings, and then you cannot make an eruv around the whole city. You have to leave a section out. That's his question. What is the status of ladders? Amar le, Rabbi answered, Hachi amarav sulam torat petach alav. That if there's a ladder, that's an access point, and therefore it's open. Since it's open, now the city has two openings, and you cannot make an eruv around the whole thing. Okay, Amar lehu Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman was there and said, no, la tasitu le. Don't listen to him. That is wrong information. Hachi amar Rav Ada amarav. He quoted the name of Rav. Rav Nachman says, I have a different tradition in the name of Rav. And mine is as follows: Sulam Torat Petach Alav ve Torat Mechisa Alav. A ladder can go either way. It always goes for leniency. Maybe you heard what Rav said only in one specific case, but not in this one. But what the law actually is that you can use a ladder. It's kind of it's a choice, and you can choose whichever way you want it to be for leniency. Torat Mechisa Alav Kede Amaran. In what case would it have a status of a wall? In this case that we just said, since it's more lenient to assume this is a wall, because then it has only one opening, and then you can make an eruv around the whole thing. So we're going to ignore the ladders and say, oh, the ladders is a difficult way to do it. We don't consider that an opening. So we are lenient in this case. In which case would we do the opposite and consider it an opening and be lenient? Torat mechisa alav kedama. Torat petach alav. בסולם שבין שתי חצרות, רסו אחד מערב, רסו שניים מערב. That would be a case where you have two courtyards and you have a wall, then you have a ladder in between. So in this case, let's say you want to make one courtyard, want to make one eruv around the whole thing. Well, then it's more convenient that you can only do that if you have an opening between them. So in that case, we'll consider the ladders like an opening, right? And then maybe they're firemen. They like climbing ladders. They don't mind it. So this is an opening for them. So it's all good. They can make one eruv. But what if they don't want it? What if they want to make two eruvs? And if you have two eruvs, then you don't want it to be an opening. That's fine too, right? You can pick whichever one you want. So that's a good example. Okay. Let's just finish this dialogue. But did Rav Nachman really say that you can use it for leniency both ways? Amar Rav Nachman amar Shemuel anshe chaser v'anshe marpeset sheshachichu velo irbu im yesh lifnehem daka arba'a ena oseret ve'im lav oseret. He says a case of people in a courtyard, and there's a balcony, a second floor balcony, and they forgot to make an eruv. So there's a ladder to get to the second floor. If he puts a partition in front of it, then it's okay. The people on top don't make the people on the bottom prohibited. Otherwise, it is a problem. Here's a picture of this case. So they generally they should make an eruv. It's owned by two different people, so they should make an eruv with each other, because then they can share a courtyard. It's the same as being on the same floor, right? Because there's a ladder here. But what if they didn't? If they didn't make an eruv, you see, the only way that these people can come down is going down through here. So then, if they don't make an eruv, the people up here will prohibit the people down here from carrying, kind of like an inner and outer courtyard that we saw. However, they says, if you put a partition like this, it's still somewhat accessible. Just it's more symbolic, showing that I'm not part of your courtyard, right? I'm out. If you do that, then it's okay. Then the people that live on the bottom can make an eruv in this enclosure. Otherwise, if you don't put a daka, then there's no clarity, and then these people are walking through, and it ruins their courtyard. Okay, the point is here that although there's a ladder, we consider the ladder to be an opening, and without the daka, the ladder would prohibit it. So, and that's the opinion of Rav Nachman. So, why'd you just say that Rav Nachman considers a ladder to be always lenient, and you can pick whatever you want? If it's always lenient, pick whatever you want, then we should ignore the ladder here and say it's inaccessible, rather than have to rely on a daka. That's the question. Oh, we're actually talking about a case. You're right. In that case, it would be a problem. But Rav Nachman could be talking about a case as follows, where the balcony is very short, is less than 10 tefachim high. If it's less than 10 tefachim high, then it's not actually its own reshut. I mean, it may as well be on the floor. And so that's why there's, even with ladder or no ladder, it's all going to be part of the courtyard. Okay, that leads to a second problem now. Hold on, if it's really that low to the floor, so if you put a little daka, what's the difference? I mean, it's still part of the courtyard. Sorry, this picture, right? It's still part of the courtyard. Just go down somewhere else. I mean, that daka doesn't do anything. The answer is b'megufefet ad eser amot techavan da'abed daka istaluk le mehacha. That's, we're going to end with that line. And so it's talking about a case where not only is it further down, but actually also has a fence, has an enclosure around most of it, except for less than 10 amot here. And so if it's less than 10 amot and you put a daka, then that ruins this, that makes it completely enclosed. And so once it's all enclosed, then it becomes its own area. And if it's its own area, then by putting this, he shows he's separating from it, and then it's okay. But if he doesn't put it, then it's an access way, an opening, and then it's close by. And since it's so low, you cannot ignore the ladder. So this is an in-between case where it's just low enough, but also somewhat separated. And such a case, really having the ladder, not having the ladder, wouldn't matter. So that is what he's talking about in the second law. So in that way, we can reconcile both of his statements in general. Of having a ladder or not having a ladder, you can be lenient if you want to consider the ladder there or not there. And in this one particular case, it would be a problem if you didn't make an eruv between this floor and someone else who lives here, unless you put a daka. But that's a very, very particular case. But we remain with Rav Nachman being permissive, being lenient in either way of having a ladder. So I guess ladders go both ways.